action. Welcome back to Show and Tell. I'm Billy. I'm glad to be back with you. It's been a rough couple of months for me. Anyway, this show is about knitting. Each week, I talk to you about the things that I like to knit. Often it's about vintage knitting, but sometimes I do veer off course. I did knit a ranunculus several years ago, and I do love it, and I feel it almost has a vintage vibe. And then I always accessorize it with vintage jewelry. Also, I veered off course to knit a sweater for my son that is covered in cables, front, back, all over the sleeves. But I'm also interested in knowing what appeals to you. What type of knitting are you engaged in? Is it vintage, or do you also venture off into other arenas? Mainly, I talk about garments, but occasionally there's a beret or a shawl or scarf. I'm currently working on fingerless mitts, which I might not show you today, but we'll definitely be talking about in the future. If you're a fairly new knitter and you have not yet ever knit a sweater, I'm here to tell you there's nothing to fear. I would love to have you join in the conversation. Tell us if you're afraid of casting on for a sweater. Maybe some people in the community will encourage you. I would certainly encourage you. I remember the first time I ever knit a sweater. I really thought that was for the big boys. I didn't think that that was something I was ever going to be able to do, despite the fact that I learned to knit when I was 4, and I had been knitting off and on the first couple decades of my life. It wasn't until I saw somebody else knitting a sweater and I thought, well, gee, if he can do it, I should be able to do it too. It's kind of like the first time you use a single lens reflex camera. I mean, I always thought that's daunting, but then I saw other people doing it and I was like, what's so special about them? If they're able, I should be able to. It's just a matter of breaking it down, learning the basics. And boy, with knitting, think about the analogy in the kitchen. If you were charged with baking a souffle and you never baked a souffle before, what would you do? You would pull out your cookbook and you would read the list of ingredients, you would line everything up, and then step by step, you would execute whatever it told you to do. Separate the egg whites, beat them until stiff or whatever, and put a collar on your souffle dish. If you did every step the way the instructions, the way the recipe tells you, there's no doubt in my mind you would get a beautiful souffle. It's the same thing with a sweater. If you cast on the number of stitches that it tells you to, and you're knitting the size that's the right size for you, provided it's a well-written pattern, you should come out with a sweater. Today, many patterns are written in all one piece. You don't even have to worry about assembling, but there's nothing wrong with knitting a sweater in pieces. This sweater, for example, was knit front, back separately, and the sleeves separately, and then sewn together. Here's a portion that I have not yet stitched up, but there's plenty of tutorials on YouTube about how to do mattress stitch. The instructions may tell you use mattress stitch. Not everybody does. I do. But it's not a problem to just stitch that up, and voila, you too can have a sweater. Now, vintage sweaters are a breed apart because they may require more skill. Usually they're only written in one size, and if that size isn't your size, then you have to really be conscious of what your gauge is and what your measurements are and the fit that you want. Often vintage sweaters are knit with negative or 0 ease. If that's not your desired look, you may have to tinker a little bit, but it's nothing to be afraid of. I suspect that most people watching this podcast drive cars. This is a very large, complicated piece of equipment, and yet we all do it with aplomb because we learn step by step and then you just execute. And like with driving or with cooking, the more you do it, the better you're going to get. So I'm here to say, don't be afraid. Take the plunge. Join me in knitting vintage sweaters or any sweater for that matter. This is my most recent finished object. It's a little undershirt, a cozy little wool undershirt knit from Color Mart's extra fine merino, super fine merino. I'll put it on the screen. I forget what the NM number is, but I'll put that on the screen as well. This cone started off being substantially more full. It was, oh, sorry, 2 over 30 NM. Lace weight, extra fine merino. This cone held 150 grams. I barely have anything left. Maybe there's a few grams here. I don't know. This sweater did not require all of the yarn that was on that cone, though. I knit a good part of my genie with this as background color. Genie, if you recall, had 9 colors. This color was my primary color, so I ordered more of it than any of the other colors. But it's so thrilling to have come out with just the right amount. It's a fluke. I didn't measure. I wasn't able to really measure because I didn't know the weight of the cone itself. If I had known that, then I would be able to calculate how much I had left on the cone to know if I was going to have enough to do this. It's a little bit higher level mathematics, but anyway, this pattern I picked up at a community center in the Shetland Islands. Was it in Unst? Yeah, I believe, yeah, we were up in Unst, the northernmost island. There are a lot of women there who used to knit professionally, and now it's a pastime for them. So they had binders filled with vintage patterns. And this one caught my eye. I loved the picot edging, and I love this little design that leaves spaces for you to lace a ribbon through. So I went to a local notions shop. It's amazing that there's even such a place not too far from where I live. Unfortunately, although he has a pretty good selection for a hole in the wall shop, he didn't have this color in a very thin satin ribbon. If anyone knows where I can get that online, I think I'm looking for about 1/4 of an inch thick satin in this kind of blush color that I would lace through there. Please let me know in the comments. Also, this edging is not knit. I had to go around and do double crochets, single crochets, even some treble crochets, which, by the way, if you're American, those terms differ in the UK, and I knew that this was a UK pattern. So trusty YouTube, I went, looked it up, saw how to do, just refresh my memory on how to do those things, because at heart, I'm not really a crocheter. I have crocheted one large Afghan. That's my main crochet project of my life as a teenager a long time ago. So I did have to refresh my memory a little bit, but it's a good skill to know. Actually, I crocheted a little cap not too long ago as well, but I hardly ever do it, so I really had to refresh my memory. But what do you think? I think I did pretty well around the armholes and around the neckline. So that's my Spencer finished object, everyone. Woohoo! I'm so thrilled because I feel like I've been knitting and knitting and knitting and not really finishing up. This, I really could have waited until I'm done because I'm maybe an hour away from completion. I still have a little bit more ribbing around the neck and then seaming up the back. And then I have some ends that still need to be woven in, but um, I'll be thrilled to finish this and send it off to San Francisco to my son. I hope there's still some cool enough weather for him to wear it this season. But I don't want to mail it until I'm finished the other sweater that I knit for him. I have shown this before. This is also about 99% complete. I still have to just finish the ribbing for the cuffs. And most of the ends are woven in at this point. This is Stephen West's Majestic Mountain. Here's the back, same pattern. A very interesting shoulder detail. These are individual welts, and I knit each of them in a slightly different melange of colors. Usually there were two wools marled together, but it's such an interesting construction. It made knitting this sweater really fun. And then here, all the color changes. This is all up to you how you want to do it. And it was a great way of using up some yarns that I had. You know, I don't keep stash, but I did have leftovers from other little projects. This yellow in here was from a cone used in my genie. Here it's marled with some green, but it's the same yellow. Oh, this blue is Quince and Co. that I knit my Harlequin sweater out of. And some of the olive green in here is also from that Quince and Co. Here it's olive green mixed with a lime green from my genie. So mixtures of things, but I thought it made it really interesting. And most of the sweater is knit with a sock yarn that was gifted me by my friend Robin, who bought it in Thailand. And I knit a whole ensemble for my son, a scarf, a balaclava, and mittens, flip top mittens. So he's gonna have like a complete set. I'll insert a picture here so you can see him wearing the other pieces. It's really snuggly. It's so lovely. I think there's a lot of alpaca in this sock yarn. Socks by Lang. Anyway, love it. But I'm on a mission to complete these totally and then ship them off to California. So tell me if finishing a sweater isn't the biggest high for you. I know it is for me. And especially when your yarn doesn't run out towards the end. That whole playing yarn chicken thing is so stressful that it's a delight when it comes out just right, Goldilocks. I would love for you to describe to me that special feeling that you get. It might be something a little different for you, but how does it make you feel when you finally finish a project, especially one that you've worked on for a very long time, or one that you pulled out of your attic and came back to? I mean, those are sort of juicy also, aren't they? Some of you might remember back in the 80s when the New York Times came out with their natural foods cookbook, and city dwellers suddenly took to baking their own bread. I had a friend, Felicia, who said it made her feel so wholesome. Well, that is how I feel when I finish a project. Wholesome, virtuous, pure, cleansed. Please tell me how it makes you feel. I wonder if you share any of those emotions. By the way, I will leave a link below in the show notes of where you can purchase your own copy of this vintage cookbook. Artificial intelligence is all over the news these days. And because I have a son who's a Googler and an MIT graduate, I tend to pay attention to a little bit of what's going on in the news. Now, this little bit of news I want to share with you is not so current. I will leave a link to the article. It's a few years old, but because it pertains to knitting and I just stumbled upon it, I thought I would bring it to your attention. Researchers at MIT have used deep learning techniques to teach a computer how to knit. The researchers have developed an algorithm that studies an image of a knitted garment and computes a series of stitches that an automated knitting machine can use to recreate it. The algorithm uses a neural network to identify which of 17 different stitch types should be used at each point of the garment. They also developed a software tool to easily lay out stitch patterns for a garment to enable novices to produce instructions for automated knitting machines. The research aims to advance knitting as a service and opens a window into deep learning forms of artificial intelligence. I encourage you to read the article. The images in the article might help you to understand a little bit better what their algorithm does. I think, if I understood it correctly, they're taking photographs of a machine knit garment and a hand knit garment and kind of merging the two of them, because as we know, hand knit garment is usually not as perfect as something that's knit by a machine, unless of course you're my Aunt Matilda, then it's hard to differentiate between her knitting and something that was knit on a machine. But most hand knit things have a little bit of irregularity, especially if they're things like yarn overs or sometimes in lace where there's open areas. Those open areas are not always exactly the same length and width each time out. They tend to vary a little bit. So the algorithm takes those into consideration when developing a set of instructions based on that kind of a picture. It's really interesting what's happening today in technology. I'm sure many of you are intrigued by that as well as I am. I wanted to show you some ways that I am thinking of accessorizing the Spencer. Oh, don't mind this. Sorry, I forgot to take this out. I actually want it here because when I get my ribbon, I want to make sure that my bow is right in the center. And I had counted out the stitches so that that's exactly the center point. Anyway, ignore that. First up, I have a pink cameo. Right now I have it on a chain, but this is a brooch. It's convertible. It has a little gizmo on the back so you can put it on a chain, but that folds down and you can just use it as a brooch. So I think this will be very pretty on here. That's one possible accessory I might add. Another would be this blue lace agate necklace that has rose quartz on the end. This gets knotted. You just loop it through and then it's asymmetrical. So you can tie it and have it be at any length. This kind of necklace that ties asymmetrically like that is sometimes known as lingerie necklace, something like that. These pink earrings are made of rubber. This is a line that I used to import from Paris. These are very old-fashioned looking. They have little crystals in them. I don't know what this material is. It's very unusual. It's not clay. It's not celluloid. I'm just not sure, but they have a real vintage vibe to them. Love those. This is an authentic Art Deco piece. It's celluloid and some coral colored glass. And I typically pair this up with these coral earrings. They're like little flowers. And they too have that coral colored glass there. And I have these pink crystal drop earrings. These are screwback. That's when you know that they're the real deal. Pretty, aren't they? So those are some of the things I have in my collection that I would pair up with my Spencer when I'm not sleeping in it. If you want to talk fiddly, this project took me too many months. I think I wasn't knitting on it monogamously, but I think it took me about 5 months. It was a lot of work. It's not that big a garment, as you can see. It's really kind of cropped. Um, there's a couple inches of ribbing, which I'm pretty sure that I did twisted rib because I like the look of it much better. So that already is a little fiddly because you're knitting through the back loop, and then on the flip side, you're purling through the back loop. But each of these columns had a 4-row repeat, and two of the rows were the same, but the other two rows you had to remember, are you on row 3 or on row 5? And one went one way and the other went the other way. There were slipping stitches over, and there was also picking up a stitch from the row below and knitting it together with the stitch that was on the needle. So a little bit unusual. It took me, I would say, up until here till I finally memorized those two changing rows. It was annoying. And a couple of people knit along with me, and they are finding it annoying too. Neither of them are done yet. Um, but the end result, I think, is really lovely. Um, being willing to get out a very fine crochet hook and crochet the picot edge and the little border that's in between it, and then the neckline, which has a slightly different patterning to it before you do the picot, was all a little bit of a challenge, but that's the beauty of vintage knitwear. There are those little touches that really distinguish them from current day things. So I just love the color. I'm really happy with this. I should put it on for you to see. Let me do that. I'll be right back. So here it is. The weather was staying quite cool until recently, but I wasn't quite done. So this is probably going to stay tucked away in some nice lavender sachet until the weather chills again. So, knowing my husband and the air conditioning in our apartment, there might be some chilly summer nights when I might want to pull it out. You know, I forgot to mention that this trim, it was drudgery because first you had to go around and make these little squares openings. Then you had to go back around yet again to do the picot edging. I would say those two things combined probably took me 3 days, I'm going to say. Very fine crochet hook. Let me get that and show it to you. This is a boy number 1. I think it's a 1, not an I. Made in the United States. It cost 10 cents back in the day. I don't know if you can see that. That's how tiny it is. But I think it was worth it, don't you? That's all I have for you this week. I am on a mission to finish these and other things, and I will be back next time to show you more of my knitting. Until then, stay well, everyone. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. Take care.